and welcome back to the 8-Bit Guy. In this episode, I wanted to take a look at the history of the Laser 128 and the Laser Compact XT. One interesting thing about early computer architectures like the TRS-80, Commodore PET, Apple II, and of course the IBM PC is that they were all built using essentially off-the-shelf parts. And one side effect of using off-the-shelf parts is that somebody else can come along and build a computer that's compatible with yours. And of course everyone is familiar with clones of the IBM PC because that architecture is essentially what evolved into the computers that most people use today. But what about the Apple II? Well, early on there were a number of clones. In fact, looking at this old radio electronics magazine from 1983, I can show you a couple. One is the Microprofessor 2. As you can see, it was a 64K AppleSoft compatibility system for $399, which was about a third of the cost of an actual Apple II system, but not entirely compatible for a number of reasons. Then of course there were systems like the Pineapple, shown here, which was a 48K system and claimed to be fully compatible. Back in 1985, New Tech Times did a whole documentary on the problem of unlicensed Apple clones.
At the U.S. Customs Office in San Francisco, agents unpacked boxes of computer contraband. The copying goes beyond mere appearance. The ROM chips contain internal programs, information specific to the operation of an Apple computer. Names like banana, orange, and pineapple are used to hint that these machines are just as good as the model they copy.
And one of the more well-known systems was, of course, the Franklin Ace 1000. So the problem with all of these systems isn't that they copied the architecture, it's that they copied the ROM code from Apple. And as you can imagine, Apple sued them all out of existence. Actually, there were hundreds of Apple II clone attempts, as are cataloged here on this website. Again, the vast majority of these were short-lived for various reasons, including lack of compatibility or being sued by Apple. But then enter the Laser 128. This computer was manufactured by VTech, or Video Technology Limited. That's right, the same company that's still around today making kids educational electronics. The Laser 128 was a little late to the game in 1986, but unlike its predecessors, it was about 95% compatible with existing software and used their own custom ROM that mimicked the functions of Apple II's ROM very closely. And for BASIC, they just licensed that directly from Microsoft, just like Apple did. This made them immune from legal action. Well, I say that, Apple did in fact sue them, but lost. The Laser 128 was meant to be a clone, or at least a direct competitor of the Apple IIc, which had come out 2 years earlier in 1984. Now, as you can see, there are certain similarities, including a side-mounted internal disk drive and a carry handle. Clearly the Laser is larger than the Apple IIc, but it sort of needs to be to accommodate the numeric keypad, which is lacking on the Apple. But you might be surprised at some of the other ways it's related to the IIc. Take for example the power brick on the IIc. It uses a truly bizarre connector. It's an inverted DIN connector, something quite rare to find even in the 1980s, and yet the Laser's power brick uses, you guessed it, the exact same connector and same pinout and voltages. The power bricks between these two systems are actually compatible. The entire port arrangement on the back is somewhat similar as well. Apple introduced a new external floppy drive connector with the IIc, and as you may have already guessed, the Laser 128 also copies this design. And while Laser did sell their own Laser branded floppy drives, both for 5¼ and 3½ inch discs, the port was completely compatible with Apple branded floppy drives as well, if you wanted to use one of those. We've also got a serial port, modem port, parallel printer, and a joystick or mouse. And we also have here a volume control and a headphone jack. Now, why you would want that on a computer that makes only beeps, I don't know, but I think they were just trying to copy the Apple IIc, which also has that. And then there's the digital video port on the IIc. Now this was meant for connecting up that proprietary portable LCD screen that Apple made for it, and Laser copied that as well, but I'll have to come back to this in a little bit as it holds a secret. As you can see, the Laser 128 is running Apple software perfectly, and that 95% compatibility actually got even better over time as companies began to internally test their own software with the Laser to ensure compatibility. Of course, the Laser 128 was more than just a clone. In many ways, it was actually better than Apple's own product. The first and most obvious thing I'll mention is the inclusion of a number pad. And while this may seem trivial, no Apple II computers had this feature except for the 2GS, which had just come to market. The Apple IIe Platinum would later include this feature a year later, so this was a nice feature. Another nifty little feature was the color mono switch. Now, the way Apple graphics work in a nutshell is that you get two modes of operation. If using a monochrome monitor, you get 40 column text or graphics with a horizontal resolution of 280. If using a color monitor, you can have 6 colors on the screen, but your resolution is basically cut in half to 140 pixels. Many computers of the era used a very similar system of trade-offs. Even the Commodore 64 had a multicolor versus a high-res mode. The main difference between how Commodore did it and how Apple did it is that with Commodore it was software selectable, so the programmer could decide which mode they thought would be best for the software in question, where with Apple it really just boiled down to which kind of monitor you had connected. If you happen to have an official Apple II monitor, they gave you a little switch, often referred to as the color killer. This allowed you to decide essentially which type of output you wanted to see, high-res monochrome or low-res color. However, the laser had this switch right on the computer, and that means you have the option to change modes on the fly, even with a standard off-the-shelf composite monitor or television. So this was a very nice feature to have. Speaking of video, I said we'd come back to this port. Well, let's take a look at the pinout of the Apple IIc video port. It's a 15-pin D-sub connector, which itself is unusual for use with video. It's the same physical connector found on the Apple IIgs and the Macintosh. However, all three of these are incompatible with each other. The video signals on the IIc, however, are the strangest, and I'll confess right now that I don't even understand what half of these signals actually do. Interestingly enough, the laser only shares these pins in common with the IIc's video port. I'm told that these are all that are required to operate the external LCD screen, but I've never actually seen one operating on a laser before, so I can't guarantee it will work. But the laser instead adds these signals to the port. You may notice the more familiar red, blue, and green signals, along with intensity, and the various sync signals. Now, if you think this looks a lot like the standard RGBI signal used by things like IBM CGA or the Commodore 128, you'd be right. So the signal is compatible, but the physical port is not, so you need some way to convert it. So I'm going to set up my Tandy monitor, which is strictly an RGB monitor, and I have this little adapter here made by Adrian Black that he was kind enough to ship to me. So I'll just plug in the Tandy monitor right here, and then plug the adapter right into the Laser 128. So let's power it on and give it a try. Here's the Oregon Trail. And how about Castle Wolfenstein? Interestingly enough, the color mono switch also works in RGB mode. Of course, there is no composite artifacting with an RGB monitor, so there has to be circuitry inside the computer that essentially mimics the effect so that we can have color here. But in order to get a better comparison, let's plug in an Apple composite monitor as well. It can actually run both monitors at the same time. Let's look at the Wolfenstein for a moment. The text itself is just about like looking at a rainbow. You can see the color in the castle has a sort of vertical striping almost. Now, you wouldn't see this on a television set because it winds up being too blurry. Now, looking at the RGB, the text is even more rainbow, but the colors of the castle are far more solid and the edges are sharper. Now, let's go back to the Oregon Trail. Now, this one's more interesting. They're using a wider font, which helps reduce the color artifacts on the composite monitor. But looking at this on the RGB monitor, the font is perfect, as are the graphics. However, here's an issue. When you look at the sky, it's clearly blue, and yet when you look at the RGB monitor, it's more of a cyan color. This is likely due to the fact that the 16 colors of an RGB monitor are fixed, and they had to map the 16 colors from the Apple to the RGB colors the best they could. But again, look at the difference in the text here. It's just so clear on the RGB monitor. The amazing thing is, this feature would have cost several $100s at the time as an add-on card for your regular Apple II computer, and it's built right into the Laser 128. In fact, a better way to see the difference in clarity would be to show off something that works in 80 columns mode, like Apple works, which brings us to the next feature to talk about. Notice there is a switch for 40 or 80 columns. The position of this switch doesn't actually affect the way the computer behaves at startup, but if you turn it to 40, it will disable the 80 column card, which could be helpful in some cases with software compatibility. Keep in mind that for an Apple II of the era, they usually required an add-on card to get 80 columns. The Laser 128 essentially came built in with the equivalent of an 80-column card. So, for example, if you wanted to run something like Apple IIc or any other 80-column software, it could handle that just fine. One neat feature you might notice is that the original Apple character set contains these Apple symbols, the open Apple and closed Apple, which can be used in software to represent the modifier keys here on the keyboard. But the Apple logo was trademarked by Apple, so the Laser used the open and closed triangle instead on the keyboard, and they also replaced those characters in the ROM with triangles too. So if you're running something like Apple IIc, it will actually show the correct key to use on screen, which I think was pretty clever. But let's compare how 80 columns looks on composite versus RGB. I mean, the composite version is readable, and it would look even better on a monochrome monitor, but this is a color monitor, and this is what you'd have to deal with if you wanted color. Now let's have a look at the RGB. Now this is where it really shines. It delivers the same crisp 80 columns you'd expect on a monochrome monitor, but this is a color monitor. Admittedly, I can get a little bit better display from the composite monitor if I turn up the brightness a little, but it's still blurry by comparison. Moving on to another feature, the Laser also has this row of function keys, but the Apple architecture doesn't really have function keys, so what do these do? Well, my understanding is these are just mapped to various control key combinations, so sort of like how they gave us a break key over here, which just maps to Control C as far as the Apple software is concerned. These all do similar things. And one other way that the Laser was better than Apple is that it was faster. Well, sort of. There were multiple versions of the Laser 128. This is what the first version looked like. I have the revision that came after that, but mine is still considered just a regular Laser 128. But there was also an EX and an EX2 version. These had faster processors that could be configured to run at 1 MHz for compatibility, 2.3 MHz, or 3.6 MHz, so almost 4 times faster than an original Apple II. Now, one of the things that was required to make this work was to put some dedicated video RAM on the motherboard and shadow that RAM to the main RAM. Now, this was necessary because in the regular Apple II, access to the RAM alternates from the CPU and the video circuit. You can't just increase the speed of the CPU because the video timing is mandatory as it has to run in sync with the video display. So that's the reason for the extra RAM on the board, so that the video RAM can operate independently. So I've read in numerous places that the Laser 128 has its own graphics modes that were potentially superior to the standard Apple graphics modes. However, I haven't found any actual evidence to support this. I haven't found any example programs to demonstrate it. I haven't found any example source code to show how to program it or how to activate these modes. And I think this myth is possibly perpetuated by some magazine articles that had a misunderstanding of the architecture. It probably boiled down to the fact that it has its own video RAM and it has that RGB mode that is, kind of non-standard for Apple. And so maybe they just assumed that was its own standard video modes, or there was some kind of confusion there. That's my guess. However, if it turns out I'm wrong and you have proof that it does have its own video mode, then please send me an email and I'll put an update in the description field letting everybody else know. One other important feature that the Laser had over the Apple IIc is that it was somewhat expandable. If you look at the side here, you may notice an expansion slot. Now, this port is almost identical to the slots you'll find inside of an Apple II. Laser sold an expansion chassis that would fit on the side and could hold 2 cards, which would map to slot 5 and 7 on a regular Apple II. However, these are nearly impossible to find. Apparently, some cards will work by just sliding them into the side like this and letting them hang out. However, the only thing I have on hand is a Mockingbird, and it doesn't appear to function in that manner for mine. However, I saw somebody on one of the discussion groups saying they had tried it in their Laser 128EX, and it worked fine. But in theory, if I had the expansion case, I could definitely use a Mockingbird with this, which is something the IIc cannot do. Well, there is a modern Mockingbird for the IIc that's quite a bit more involved to install, but you know what I mean. The Laser 128 could accept regular Apple II expansion cards, whereas the IIc could not. And the last thing I want to mention that made the Laser 128 a better computer than the Apple is its price. It was cheaper. Originally, the Apple IIc retailed for $1,295. You could buy the Laser for $479. That's right, almost 3 times cheaper for a product that actually does more. Now, you can imagine Apple must have been really annoyed by this. Originally, the Laser 128 was sold mail order only. Magazine advertisements were one of the most common methods to spread awareness. The largest retailer in the USA was Central Point Software, and at some point VTech actually bought Central Point Software and continued to use them to distribute the computer. However, eventually some retailers such as Sears started to sell the Laser. In fact, you can see it here in this 1987 Sears catalog for sale for just $3.99. The headline is Apple IIe or C compatible Laser 128. It was important to mention that because Laser had no brand recognition with the general public. If you look closely, you'll see the regular 128 was $399 and the EX model was $499, so they were selling both units. It's also interesting that it was shown here with an RGB color monitor. And it says order connecting cable below. And there's some cables listed at the bottom here for like $16 or $17. One of these must have been the RGB adapter. And on the next page of this year's catalog, you'll see they're selling the IBM-compatible Laser Compact XT for $499. And here it is. Notice that it looks almost identical to the Laser 128, but that's really about all it has in common is the appearance. The Laser 128 is not particularly rare. I mean, you can go to eBay and type in Laser 128 on any given day. You'll probably find at least 2 or 3 of these up for sale. So they are available. The Laser XT, on the other hand, now these things are rare as unicorns. And while it looks almost identical to the Laser 128, it's not an Apple clone at all. It's actually a clone of the IBM PC. Okay, so let's talk about some of the interesting things here on the back. First of all, you have this huge connector here. This is for an external drive, and yeah, finding one of these today is pretty darn difficult. It's probably difficult even back in the day. Then we have your standard parallel printer joystick, which was actually kind of an unusual thing to be built into a low-end PC machine of some kind, because that was typically on a card. Composite and RGB, which we'll talk about in a minute, and a mono color switch. Over here we have a standard RS-232 port, which was 25 pin, pretty common of the era. And then of course we've got that same physical port that the Laser 128 and the Apple IIc have, but it's wired completely different and is of course not compatible. The weird thing is there's also a power out, which, was not terribly uncommon for the time. A lot of computers would have a special place for the monitor to get power. The weird part is this is the only power going into this port here is DC power. So that means the only thing they would have available here is also DC power. So I'm not sure what kind of monitor would have ever plugged into that. I've never seen anything that would plug into that. So that's quite interesting. And of course, over on the side, we've got your regular 360K disk drive and a power switch. So notice we have power switch here, but on the Laser 128, this is where we had the volume and headphone jack. There is no volume and headphone jack on the XT. And you may, of course, notice the Laser 128 has a bus expansion port over here where there is nothing on the XT. No sort of cards can be installed. So let's go ahead and boot this thing up. One interesting thing is that when we power up the computer, the boot screen actually shows the BIOS is made by Central Point Software, so this must have been after the acquisition by VTech. Of course, most anything you do with this computer will require booting an MS-DOS disk first, and I think the first thing we should do is try out some games. I'll start with California games. I've tried the more color mode, which is kind of a little trick that it can do, but it just doesn't seem to work on this computer, so we'll have to do number 1. So what we're looking at here is the standard 4-color CGA mode on an RGB monitor. California Games uses different palettes for different screens to give it a little bit of variety, but ultimately this computer is pretty much a stock CGA system. Here's Planet X3 running in 4-color CGA, or how about Thexter? So as I mentioned earlier, the computer also has a composite out, and as most of you know by now, CGA was capable of 16 colors on composite. Unfortunately, very few games actually supported this, and most were very early CGA games, like California Games. And so what I'll do here is I'll set up the composite monitor for another comparison, and here's California Games in 16 colors. Pretty much everything about this game looks better in composite mode. Here's another Indy 500. Unfortunately, the CPU is barely capable of running this game. And of course, my own game, Planet X3, also supports it, but now I want to show you the big problem with it. I booted up the computer 3 different times, and as you can see, the colors came out different each time. In fact, none of these are the correct palette. Now, unlike the official CGA card from IBM, it seems a lot of clones didn't lock the color burst signal to the correct place on boot up, and it could wind up at random locations. And the Laser is quite guilty of this. That's actually one of the reasons I put this color palette switcher in the game, which can help to a certain extent, which means the composite mode isn't all that useful, and in most cases games would appear in 4-color CGA mode. I also want to talk about this color mono switch. It sort of does the same thing as on the Laser 128, but here on the XT, it only affects the composite output. RGB is totally unaffected. But even on composite, it's kind of weird. Watch this. I'm going to flick it to mono. And well, the monitor is still trying to display color. It's like there's still color signal there, but not quite. So everything is just an artifact color. I can put this Apple monitor into mono mode, and it seems that toggling the switch is doing more than just killing the color signal. It actually changes the way the pixels are displayed. Kind of interesting. Anyway, I'm sure the purpose behind this would be to get the best picture possible when connected to a monochrome composite monitor. Really, about the only feature that this computer had over a standard IBM XT is the turbo mode. By default, it boots up to the standard 4.77 MHz, but you can press Control 5 or Control 8 to toggle speeds. And the turbo LED will light up to let you know you're in turbo mode. I'm not quite sure how fast it is in turbo mode, but I'm guessing 7.1 MHz. You can actually see the difference in speed just by listing the directory. Here's in regular mode, and now in turbo mode. Unfortunately, even with turbo on, games like Indy 500 just barely run. Of course, the biggest problem with this computer is storage. It was really difficult finding software to demonstrate on this thing that would work with a single floppy drive. Some programs would quite literally complain that it required 2 floppy drives or a hard drive to work. There's a lot of software that technically would run on this computer if only it had a hard drive. Even by 1987, most all IBM clones had at least 2 floppy drives or a single floppy with a hard drive. And while you could get an external floppy drive to fit this weird port, I would imagine finding it would be a problem, and by the time you paid for that, you might as well have just gotten the larger Laser XT desktop computer, which had all the expandability you need. So I think the reason that the XT is harder to find today is because I don't think it actually sold as many units as the Laser 128. The question is why, and I think the answer can probably be boiled down to a couple of things. First of all, the Laser 128 was about the only game in town. As far as Apple clones go, there weren't a lot of other Apple clones, actually more or less no Apple clones out there besides the Laser 128. Plus, it was better than an Apple in so many ways and way cheaper. It was a bargain. So it's kind of a no-brainer why people would flock to the Laser 128 if you were in the market for an Apple clone. But the Compact XT had to compete with other IBM clones, which were ubiquitous by this point. Everybody was making IBM clones, and it was especially difficult for them to compete with companies like Tandy or Compaq, who were making very inexpensive and very well-equipped PC clones. Anyway, the last thing I want to say about these lasers, and particularly about the Laser 128, is they seem to be pretty reliable. Now, I realize this is just anecdotal evidence, but everybody I know that has one, it works perfectly and has never needed to repair, including this one. Now, I can't say that about the XT because I actually did have to repair this one. In fact, I did a whole video on that a couple of years ago. But, with such a small sample size, it's really difficult to draw any conclusions from that. But I think that overall, these laser machines were pretty reliable. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed learning about these laser machines, and I guess that's it for this episode. So, as always, thanks for watching.